Here we go. So we are in Isaiah 15 tonight. Join me in Isaiah 15. I know, if you were with us last week, I know it's really difficult to know where we're going to be at because we just finished Isaiah 14. So here we are in Isaiah 15 tonight. We're in a section, I'm calling it the second section of the book of Isaiah. This really just started here in chapter 13. We're looking at in this section, letters that were written to the foreign, I'm not even going to say to, they're written about the foreign nations around Israel, and they're not really intended for Isaiah or anyone else to take these letters to these foreign nations. They're really designed to be a help for the people of Israel. They're designed to affect Israel and to talk to Israel about these nations all around them that have been influential in their existence. So think about it this way. God could write a letter to you and to the people that you're enjoying great relationships with, and he could write letters to that person in your life that you're not enjoying a great relationship with. And that would be good for him to send letters to everybody and give them the direct advice they need. But picture for yourself the Lord writing you a letter about that person in your life that you're really struggling with. How would that affect you? When you come to the Lord in prayer for someone that you're struggling with, it changes you, right? Well, picture God writing a letter to the one you're struggling with and giving it to you. That's the idea of these chapters. Just picture how that would kind of change your perspective on how you handle them, how you interact with these people, to hear God's mind towards them. And that's the idea of these chapters, these particular prophecies. And so, we started the book in chapter 1 through 12 with God's mind towards Israel, that, hey, judgment is coming for you, Judah and Jerusalem. But we said, although judgment begins at the house of the Lord, it doesn't stop there. And so we have these chapters now in this section, chapter 13 through 23, that now addresses these other nations. So they're really here designed to instruct Israel about these other nations. That's going to do a lot of things. It's going to remind them, look, they're going to get what's coming to them also. What will that do? That'll help you focus on yourself again, right? They're not going to get away with it. Okay, God's got them covered, so now I'm back to just thinking about what I need to do to live right, what I need to do to live a life that's pleasing God. So, additional to these messages showing, God's heart to want to save people and bring everyone to righteousness, that's really a big part of these messages. It's not just that he's writing them about their judgment to come, but in all of these chapters, you see God's heart to say to them, you've had an opportunity, or you will have an opportunity to come and be saved and bring, he wants to bring righteousness to everybody. And so many of these nations we're going to look at, we're going to be able to trace the way they interacted with Israel from next time we're together, we're going to look at Ethiopia. Do you know how many times Ethiopia is in your scriptures, starting in Genesis chapter 2? You go up to the fact that Moses later in life married an Ethiopian wife. Ethiopia is all through the Old Testament. Then we get into the New Testament, and there's Ethiopia with Philip on the road down to Ethiopia. He interacts with the Ethiopian eunuch. We have prophecies of things that are going to happen with Ethiopia yet in the future. It's all so these chapters, just make sure you understand that these surrounding nations, that's not something arbitrary. They're very directly involved with God's plan that has happened, that is happening now, and that even will happen. In fact, I mentioned Ethiopia that we'll get to coming up. I think it's chapter 18. Chapter 18, we'll get to Ethiopia. I don't want to get into that message right now, but even in the news today, this area the Bible calls Ethiopia is modern-day Sudan into modern-day Ethiopia. And Sudan, you may not have even heard this because of everything that's happening in Israel and in the Ukraine. But just yesterday, there was a slaughter of 800 non-Muslims in that area by these Muslim forces trying to cleanse the area of non-Muslims. You don't even hear about that. And so that whole area is once again in quite a large conflict. It could again become a war You might have heard of Sudan and Darfur and those regions that were involved in a lot of war in the last decade. It's coming back again. And everything that's happening with Israel is now instigating this again. So we talk about how Turkey and Iran and Russia are already lined up to fit the scenario of Ezekiel 38 and 39 with them coming against Israel coming soon. But Ethiopia is also listed in those nations in Ezekiel 38 as coming against Israel. And even yesterday in the news, we see how more and more all the time they are siding with the forces that are against Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians and the rest. And so would you please keep that as your background? You know, as we're reading these chapters, sometimes you look at this and you think, we're going to read a prophecy against the country of Moab. Like, do they even exist today? You know, and you're like, how does this relate to me? You know, but sometimes when you come to the Word of God, you have to say to yourself, it's not about me. It's about God's master plan, and He's allowed us insight. And just having that insight into His master plan for what's happening down through the ages, it should give us even just that, should give us this reminder like, man, He really does have the end from the beginning sorted out. He's got it all sorted. He's seen it all. He knows it all. He knows every nation and where they're going to be from the beginning of time to the end of time. He's got it all. You know, and if there's nothing else we take from these chapters, we can at least take that, right? We read God writing to these other nations, and it's as if He knows everything about them. And just let even that sink in, that we should have that type of confidence. And so I want to bring tonight's message in this section here, 15, 16, 17, really to a head by talking not just about the judgment that God's talking about, but in these chapters specifically, I think we see even more of God's heart to want to bring salvation and help. You know, life is really all about relationships. Life is not designed to be lived in a vacuum. It's not. And those that just, you know, pull in the driveway into their garage, never talk to the neighbors, shut the garage door, go inside, never talk to them, and you just don't have relations in your life anymore. And then all night long, then you're like this on the phone, right? Okay? So that is not the way God designed us to be. We're designed to have relationships and build relationships with people, and it starts with God. And not just does it start with our relationship with God, but it starts with Him role modeling the idea that He wants relations with us. He's the initiator that comes and says, I want to know you. I want you to know me. I want a relationship. And He's the model for all this. So, you know, we talked about how these chapters are called the burdens. You know, a burden given to this nation or that nation. And the burden just means, you know, a heavy message. You know, that's heavy, man. Back in the 60s, right? That's heavy. Right? That's the idea of a burden. It's heavy. It's a heavy message. And so even here, we'll hear these burdens given to Moab and Syria tonight in these chapters. And I really think you're going to see some things where it talks about things that cause relationships to change. And so the title of the message I've given this is My Heart Shall Cry Out. I don't want us to think of these messages that God's talking about these other nations in some kind of sterile vacuum as if God doesn't care. Well, let me write you a heavy message about how I'm going to judge you. There, done. No, it's not really like that. There's so many indicators in these chapters that God's heart is invested in wanting these nations to come to know Him, and for these nations really even to affect Israel in a positive way. And so with that kind of as the theme, I just want to open up chapter 15 with our first point. Here's the first time really that relationships can change. And chapter 15 is going to illustrate this to us. Relationships change whenever self-focus breaks relationships. That's a changer. That's a game changer. Whenever we get into ourselves, relationships can change. What does it take for you to lose a good marriage? Nothing. Do nothing with your spouse for the next 5 years and tell me how good your relationship is. Right? That's all it takes to lose a relationship, is just be into yourself and do nothing. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, it says it this way. It talks about how be careful lest at any time you drift. Think about that. We don't have to actively leave the Lord, but to do nothing is enough to, I mean, you're a boat in the water, right? And when you're a boat in the water, if you don't actively participate, you're going to drift. You're going to go right downstream. And that's sort of the same idea. When you're into yourself, when you're not focused on producing that relationship, living in that relationship, it's going to fall apart. And Moab here in chapter 15, this is the burden of Moab in chapter 15. They're a great example of a nation that God speaks against, not because they had anything super big that you'd say, oh, right there, they did, oh boy, that was really bad. I mean, they did a couple things that were kind of scoundrelly. I get it. But they don't have anything in their past that you'd say like, oh man, God should turn them into Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not like that. But we're going to see that their pride and their selfishness led them to this place. And so if you really want a full kind of composite sketch on Moab, the nation of Moab, you'd want to read Jeremiah chapter 48, Ezekiel chapter 25, and Amos chapter 2. That would be kind of your full composite sketch of Moab. We'll draw out a little bit about who Moab is here in just a minute. So chapter 15, it's verse 1, just the first few words. This is the burden of Moab that he's going to write about. The burden of Moab. So God told Israel, don't destroy them because they're family. In the book of Deuteronomy, when God established the nation of Israel, knowing that Moab was put right on the outside border of the land that God gave to Israel, God told the children of Israel, don't destroy them. You know why he told them that? Because they're family. Moab is one of the children of Lot, Abraham's nephew. And so when Israel got their land, God said, I've given Moab their land. Did you know that? God didn't just give Israel their land. God gave Moab their land. And then God instructed Israel, treat them right. They're family. They're family. There's already a relationship there. There's a natural relationship there. Treat them right. But yet, we find all throughout the history with Moab that Moab really didn't treat Israel right. You maybe remember the story under King Balak. Yeah, King Balak with the prophet Balaam. And King Balak of Moab wanted to curse Israel, and he hired the Israeli prophet Balaam to curse them. And then even again later, in the time period of the judges, Moab had a king Eglon, and King Eglon was trying to rule over much of Israel at that time. And that's when the Lord raised up the judge Ehud to drive out the Moabite rule over them. So they've had a sketchy history with Moab being right on their border. They've not really treated each other like family. Sometimes they do, and then sometimes they don't. It's almost like teenage brothers. Most of their relationship, it's like they'll hit each other, and then the next day they're sitting down to eat dinner or something, Under the time period of the kings, under Saul and David, it really didn't get a ton better, although Israel had a lot more of the influence. King Saul and then David mostly controlled this territory of the Moabites. And you have to think that David probably treated the Moabites pretty good because his great-grandmother was Moabitess. You might remember that. Ruth, the Moabitess, was David's great-grandmother. So in the time period of David, there's pretty good indication that he treated the Moabites well. In fact, at one point, David, when he was running from King Saul, before David took the throne, you might remember, he took his mom and dad down to Moab to kind of hide them away from King Saul. And so David had a pretty good relationship with the Moabites, but mostly because they had a lot of influence over the Moabites at that time. So this is this nation that we're talking about here, these Moabites, right down by the Dead Sea area today. Well, even then, they were right down by the Dead Sea. Okay, so verse 1 again, the burden of Moab, because in the night, Ar of Moab, that's a city, is laid waste and brought to silence, because in the night, Kir, that's another city of Moab, is laid waste and brought to silence. All of these are cities in mountains he's going to be talking about here. Verse 2, it says in verse 2, he has gone up to Baath and to Dibon, the high places. That's the places they worshipped. But he went there to the high places to weep. Moab shall howl over Nebo, that's a mountain, and over Medeba. On all their heads shall be baldness, and every beard shall be cut off. In verse 3, in their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth, and on the tops of their houses and in their streets every one shall howl, weeping abundantly. And so these 6 places here, all throughout Moab, most of these are cities, and then you get to some other ones here that are not cities. All of these places are being sacked by the invaders. And of course, the invaders in this day, we've already talked about this extensively, is the Assyrians coming from what would be Kirkuk, Iraq today, the northern part of Iraq. This was completely drawing a blank now. Jonah went to Nineveh. Nineveh was their headquarters back then in the Assyrian capital. So it's talking about this invasion of the Assyrians. The Nebo that it mentions, it's an interesting one. That's not a city that was ransacked, but Nebo is actually the mountain there, and that they did build up a village around. But you might remember Nebo because when the children of Israel were getting ready to go into the promised land, God told Moses, you can't go into the land, but what? But you can see it. Go up to Mount Nebo and look over there. And so this is the very place that Moses went up to the mountain and looked across the Jordan to look into the promised land from that perspective. And so it's there in Moab. But they notice as this ransacking is prophesied to come, it says there that in verse 2 it is that the Moabites are going to go to their high places to weep and to wail, but they're going to find no help there. And then, of course, here in verse 2 and 3 is all of these traditional signs of mourning, the baldness. They would shave themselves, sitting in sackcloth and open wailing. These are all signs, obviously, of mourning. Just this prediction, how they're gonna see their cities being ransacked, and they will be sitting and mourning, weeping, and wailing. And you think, okay, but God, you jumped right into this judgment. I don't know why. What's happening here? Why is this happening? Well, in some of the other passages that we talked about, I mentioned Jeremiah 48 is one of the other places. I'm just going to say them one more time in case you didn't write it down. Jeremiah 48, Ezekiel 25, and Amos 2. Those are really the places you want to read to get that full story of Moab. But in the Jeremiah 48, it tells us more of the why behind the judgment. And you read it here in Isaiah and you're like, no context. God, this seems harsh. The context, right? The context from Jeremiah 48 says Moab has settled for the comfortable life. That's not the King's English on it, but that's the expression from Jeremiah 48 verse 11. They have settled for the comfortable life. That's a sin. We were made for relationships. We were made to serve and honor God, to be productive. There's songs we sing about it today, right? We weren't made to survive. We were made to thrive, right? These are all true statements. And this was the heart of Moab's problem. What would cause that? Pride, selfishness, just looking out for number one. That's all I care about. I mean, how much do you go into the world and talk to people? I hear this all the time from people. Some news there's major news happening in the world right now, right? Pretty major stuff, okay? Wars in multiple places, elections, lots of big stuff in the news. How many people do you talk to and they're like, I don't care. I don't look at that. I don't even know the first thing about any of the news. And I'm just thinking like, what do you pay attention to? But they'll tell you every stat of the latest, stupid bowl game or whatever. They'll tell you they'll tell you like the offensive tackles statistics. And you're like, I thought you only tracked the quarterback. It's like they know everything. And you just think to yourself, you are burying your head in the sand. And it's an intentional thing. And that's kind of the idea of Moab. Like they just want themselves. That's all they're interested in. They've settled. There's 2 things that Jeremiah 48 says. They've settled for the comfortable life and they haven't helped anyone else. They haven't helped anyone else. See, there's sins of commission, right? Oh, you just stole that thing. Oh boy, I shouldn't have, slept around, whatever. Those are sins of commission, but there's sins of omission. Sins of omission, the idea that, God's telling you, honor me, serve me, love me. Do you love me? If you love me, you'll what? Keep my commandments, right? And this is their sin. Moab is the perfect expression of, maybe they're not the nation that's out there known for all of their wickedness. Moab is the nation that's known for living fat and happy. And that's it. That's all they're known for. And not being any good to anyone else. And so we'll just keep going. Verse 4. Verse 4. If you get to a hard word that looks like a town, it probably is a town, okay? So just know that, okay? Verse 4. And Heshbon shall cry, and Elilah, their voice shall be heard even unto Jahaz. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out. His life shall be grievous unto him. And so I'll point this one out to you real quick, actually. Heshbon to Elilah, that's actually the northernmost of the southernmost cities in Moab. So this is actually trying to make the impression with us that this is happening for the entire country. From north to south, the entire country of Moab, this devastation is coming to them all. Verse 5, it's just a key verse here, just a key insight to some of why God's giving this to us. Verse 5, my heart shall cry out. That's the Lord speaking through Isaiah. My heart shall cry out for Moab. His fugitives shall flee unto Zoar, a heifer of 3 years old. That means that's how they'll flee, like a heifer that's 3 years old. For by the mounting up of Luhith with weeping shall they go it up. For in the way of Horonaim they shall rise up a cry of destruction. So the idea is that the Moabites are actually having to flee from their city's destruction, and they're actually going the entire way to these Edomite cities. Like Zoar, for example, is an Edomite city, which is their neighboring nation. And so it's describing them fleeing the whole way out of their country from this destruction that's coming upon them, which we know will be at the hands of the Assyrian. Interesting that it mentions that they're going to flee the whole way to Zoar. Again, who is this? This is Moab, right? The nation of Moab was founded by the man Moab. And who is Moab? The son of Lot, right? And of course, these two sons, Ammon and Moab, were born, conceived out of this incestuous relationship that his daughters forced upon him. Okay? So what's interesting is, Lot, if you remember, Lot was fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And where did Lot go? To Zoar, as he fled Sodom and Gomorrah. And here we have a picture of Lot's descendants having to flee to Zoar. It's just a fascinating picture here. But notice really in verse 5, my heart shall cry out for Moab. Have you ever read the Bible and thought to yourself, well, God only has a heart for Israel. Like he just hates everybody else. He never has any. No. Please, would you just get that out of your mind right now? That has never been the heart of God to say, well, I just care about Israel. God's plan has always been for everyone to come to the gospel and to receive Christ and to be saved. And in the Old Testament, come to Israel, see what God is doing, and accept it. They called them proselytes back then. They just didn't call them converts. They didn't call them Christians. They called them Jewish proselytes. Those that looked at God's revelation to Israel and said, that's true. That's right. I need that. And they came to faith in what God was doing, and they were saved. They were saved, and they weren't Israelites. This is a good expression of God showing his heart for non-Israelites, and saying, my heart shall cry out for them. It really reminds me, in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, the Lord says, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked would turn from his evil ways. That's the heart of God. If we have this impression that somehow God has his select people that, God's love is upon them, and nothing else matters. Please, would you just correct that right now? Correct it yourself and then correct it in somebody else, okay? This has never been the heart of God. He loves everyone. He has always wanted everyone to come to himself. In each dispensation, come to himself and be saved and head to heaven. That's always been his heart. He has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked would turn to him. And so verse 6, through the end of the chapter here, verse 6, for the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate, for the hay is withered away, the grass faileth, there is no green thing. Therefore the abundance they have gotten, and that which they have laid up shall they carry away to the brook of the willows. For the cry, in verse 8, the cry is gone round about the borders of Moab, the howling thereof unto Iglium, and the howling thereof unto Beer Elim. For, in verse 9, for the waters of Dimon shall be full of blood. For I was For I will bring more upon Dimon, lions upon him that escapeth of Moab, and upon the remnant of the land. So now it's describing even the resources of Moab, the rivers and the waters will be destroyed. And you just say to yourself, well, just seeking to live an isolated, comfortable life, it's not that bad, is it? But it is. Think of it in the New Testament. Jesus gave us a parable where he gave talents to people, right? He gave 1 talent to each person. There's another story where he gives a different amount of talents, but in this parable Jesus told, he gave 1 talent to multiple different people. One of the guys went out and did what? Invested the money and returned 10 talents. When the Lord came back, he's like, okay, what did you do while I was gone? He's like, Lord, I invested it and I turned it around a profit. Look, here it is. Came to the next guy. He had 5 out of the 1. Came to the next guy who he had given 1 to, and he's like, oh, I knew you were an austere man, and I didn't want to mess this up. This is his excuse. I didn't want to mess this up, so, I just kept it. And the Lord's like, you lazy servant. How much effort would it have been if you'd have just taken it to the bank? Right? I mean, that's kind of the way it reads. Like, it wouldn't have been that much effort to just go get the interest money, let alone actually go and put some thought into how to, profit here. And the Lord chastised him and said, you've done nothing with what I've given to you. I tell you, that's the challenge to Moab. And maybe that speaks to somebody directly in the room today or maybe listening. That heart needs to go. This idea that, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just taking it easy. I just don't want to mess up. I'm just going to go along to get along. Don't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't want to accidentally lose my talent, so I'm just going to hide it. Man. How many times does the Scripture give us the admonition to be there for each other? Get involved. Get dirty. Get dirty. How do you do Galatians chapter 6, verse 2? Bear one another's burdens, and what does it say? And so fulfill the law of Christ. That's to us. Be there for each other. Be ready to get dirty with each other. That's okay. Things are going to go wrong, and things are going to get overwhelming from time to time, and we're there for each other. But if you're all holed up in your own little house burying your talent, then you won't be available. And I submit to you, this was their problem. And you can get more of their sins from those other sections that we talked about, Ezekiel 25 and Jeremiah 48, name us too. You can get more of their problem listed there. The Ezekiel version here really just gives us their judgment and God's heart. My heart. In verse 5, my heart cries out for Moab. What an amazing thought to be reminded of. And so, self-focus, breaking relationship. Well, we go to chapter 16, and it continues to talk about Moab here for one more chapter. In chapter 16, God gives them some counsel on what they should do about their troubles. And we're going to really set up chapter 16 this way, that there's another time that relationships change, not just because we're self-focused, but relationships also change when mutual aid comes along and restores it. Now, we just closed the last part of chapter 15 by talking about Galatians chapter 6, bear each other's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that's going to be now the theme of chapter 16. God's going to counsel them, and he's going to say, you need to be there for each other. That's a way to bring relationships back. Do you have a relationship strained with somebody? Have you ever thought about just bring them a chicken, a pre-cooked chicken to their front door? All the women are like, chicken? What is he talking about? Look, you bring me a pre-cooked meal to my front door, I'm going to be happy with you, okay? Maybe you want some flowers. I don't know what you want. I want a pre-cooked chicken, okay? But you get the idea. Can we go back to the idea now? Okay, you get the idea. Like, just go spontaneously do something for them. Tell me if that's going to fail. It won't. At the worst, they're going to think you're strange and it's going to lighten the air, right? Maybe if you bring them a chicken, they'll think it's strange. It's still going to lighten the air. It's still going to bridge the gap. And that's what we're looking to do. Just be there for each other. Find a way that you could just go get involved. Maybe you can find a specific need they have and meet that. But even if you can't, bring them a chicken, okay? Whatever. So that's really the theme. Take a look at this in chapter 16. We'll go to verse 1. It's not a chicken, it's going to be a lamb. In chapter 16, verse 1. Send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land. That's talking about Israel. The land they're talking about is Israel. From Selah. He's counseling Moab. Send to Israel, to the ruler of the land of Israel, from the city of Selah to the wilderness, unto the mountain of the daughter of Zion. That's of course Israel. Verse 2. For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. So it's talking about how Moab is on the run. They're being chased by the Assyrians. They're the ones in trouble. And God's counsel to them is, send a peace offering to Israel. The one country that can help you. The one country that knows God. Send a peace offering to them. Moab, in your distress, send to the people of God a peace offering that you want to dwell with them. That's the idea behind all this. Hey, listen, can we have a mutual pact here? Look, can we help you and you help us? Can we agree to peace? Come to God. Come to God in this way. And so he's counseling them to restore relationship with the true God. Lot would have told them about the true God. You understand this as your background. Now, Moabites, they worshiped the false god Chemosh as a nation, as a whole, generally speaking. That's who they worshiped. They came from Lot. Lot was called what? A righteous man. Lot knew the Lord. And so they had this in their background. And the Lord's counseling them, come back. Come back to what you know is right. Bring a peace offering to Israel. Restore that relationship with your long-lost cousins. And come back to me in such a way. Verse 3. There's quite a change here. Verse 3. Take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcasts, betray not him that wanders. Now verse 4 switches. Verse 4. Let my outcast dwell with thee, Moab. It changes. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. For the extortioner is at an end. The spoiler ceases. The oppressors are consumed out of the land. So you got verse 1, you got verse 2, you got verse 3. It's talking about Moab as you're fleeing from the Assyrians. Seek peace with Israel. You're trying to dwell with Israel. Okay, go seek peace with Israel. Let Israel help you out. And then we got this switch that just hits us in verse 4 because of what? Because we talked about this. With prophecy, there's a near-term fulfillment and there's a long-term fulfillment. There's parts of prophecy that are intended to be right now, and then all of a sudden, boom, it switches. Remember we talked about that last time we were together. How you're reading along and you're like, okay, this is going to happen in Isaiah's day. This is going to happen like next year. And then what is that? Oh, that's the day of the Lord, right? That's way later. We've got the same thing happening here. He's talking about Moab on the run. Moab needs help. And then all of a sudden, verse 4, let my outcast dwell with you, Moab. What's the switch? So, number one, before we get to the switch, Moab, God's response to Moab is twofold, really. Verse 3, his response to Moab is live justly. Live justly. Start there. It does no good to seek peace with somebody else. It does no good to go into mutual aid with somebody else if you're still living a heathen life. So he starts in verse 3 to say, Moab, clean it up. Clean up your act. And then he counsels them to let God's outcast dwell with him. So do all of that. The one giving the help may very well be the one that needs the help later. Have you found that in life yet? At one moment you're the one offering the help, and then the next year all of a sudden you're the one that needs a little help. Life has its cycles like that, it seems. And so sure enough, that's exactly what happens. We go to verse 4 and all of a sudden God is telling Moab, okay, now you're going to let my outcast dwell with you. See, I believe verse 4 will not happen until halfway through the tribulation. There's a lot of Bible you can put together to go into this. We're not going to go and read much of these things. I'm going to give you some verses that you can piece this all together. But our intention is not to to prove all this out right now. I'll give you the verses. You can go look that up for yourself. But I believe that this exact fulfillment of verse 4, where Moab is going to let the outcasts of Israel dwell with them, is going to happen halfway through the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation that's coming and coming soon. So there's going to be at the halfway point, the Antichrist is going to go into the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, and he's going to desecrate that temple. And that's going to be the mark that tells the world that this is not a man of peace, this Antichrist, but he's now declaring himself to be God in the rebuilt Israeli temple. And that's the time that Israel is told to flee. We actually read about this in Matthew 24. Jesus himself told us about this event. And maybe I'll just read just this one. It's Matthew 24, starting in verse 15. Jesus says, "When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let him that is in Judea flee." To where? Jesus says, to the mountains. And then he goes on to say, don't let him turn back. Don't let him come back for this or come back. Just go and just flee to the mountains. In fact, we read about this exact abomination of desolation, which, look, it's a big word. All it means is the Antichrist goes into the rebuilt temple and desecrates it with a sacrifice of his own. It's not godly, and declares himself to be God. That is the abomination that makes desolate, is the idea. And so Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 details that out. And then you get to the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, it speaks in more picturesque form. In Revelation chapter 12, it's just a couple of verses I'll bounce around. In verse 6, picturing Israel as a woman, it says in 12:6, the woman fled unto the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that she should flee there for 1,260 days, which is exactly the second half of the tribulation. You go on then skip down to verse 13, and when the dragon, that is Satan, saw that he was cast unto the earth, he pursued after the woman. Who's the woman? Israel. He pursued after the woman which brought forth the man-child. Who is that? Jesus. Okay. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly unto the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for 3.5 years. I'll just sum it up for now. And so here it is. At the halfway point of the tribulation, Israel will need to flee as the Antichrist truly declares his intentions and comes against them. Interesting enough, when you get into Daniel chapter 11, describing the Antichrist's conquests as he goes around the world during this second half of the tribulation, where he's finally no longer seen as a man of peace, but seen as a man of war. Daniel 11 speaks of Moab and Edom and some parts of Ammon that escape out of Antichrist's control, which all of those nations are the modern country of Jordan today. And so the book of Daniel describes how the modern country of Jordan will escape out of the Antichrist's control in that day. We'll get to other ones later where it's the exact opposite, where they do fall under the Antichrist's control. Now, what is this place? What are we talking about? Well, go back and just look at verse 1, chapter 16, verse 1. Let my outcast dwell with you. Well, where? It said flee, Jesus said flee to the mountains, right? This word Selah in chapter 1, this Edomite city, this is the city the modern name of that city is the city of Petra. The city of Petra. It's still there today. You may have seen the massive rock carving in the mountainside. Maybe I should have brought a picture tonight, but this city of Petra, biblical word is Selah, but it's Petra. This is the place where Israel will be fleeing. Okay, there are something like 8 million Jews in the land today. Okay, the city of Petra is estimated itself to be able to hold 6 million people in the city of Petra. And if you look at it, you're just like, that's a huge rock carved entrance. That's great. There's a lot behind that. You don't see in the tourist pictures. Okay, and so this is the prophecy of where they're going to go during this time. And so, but then just here's the capstone sort of to this thought. We can read in Zechariah, which I'm really excited to get to the book of Zechariah, one of the last books of the Old Testament. It's probably the book of prophecy that people overlook the most. Zechariah. It's just an amazing little 14 chapters, but it describes in Zechariah 14, it describes the Lord's second coming and how he's coming back to get them. He's going to come right there to Petra to rescue them. It's Zechariah 14 verse 4, just 2 verses. It says, in his feet, this is the Lord Jesus, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, that's in Jerusalem, of course, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west, and there shall be a very great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove towards the north, and half towards the south. And then in verse 5, and you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee like you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with him. And you read the context around this, Zechariah chapter 14, and you see the Lord coming back at the second coming to receive his own. And this is the very section of the book where it says Israel then looks at him and says, they're wondering, like, who is this? Do you remember in Luke 24 that we just did? The 2 men on the road to Emmaus? They didn't know who it was. And then all of a sudden it says in the breaking of bread, they knew who it was, right? And you're thinking like, did they see the nail prints? Well, this is another one like that. He comes back to them as pictured in Zechariah 14. And they're like thinking like, who is this that's here to rescue us? Picture somebody knocking on, you're in a safe house, and somebody's knocking on the door like, come on, it's safe. And they're like, who is this that's saving us? And then it says, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. That one always gets me. And it says, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. And they're gonna say, where did you get these wounds? And it's like the follow-up story to Luke 24, except it's a different group of people. And they're gonna say, where did you get these wounds? And he's gonna say, these are the wounds I received in the house of my friends. Can you imagine him saying that to his people, Israel? Oh, yeah, I got these from my friends. And wow, that's enough to break your heart, right? And bring you to him. And that's exactly what's going to happen. We read in Revelation chapter 11, chapter 11 of Romans, we read, it says, it literally uses the words, and then all Israel will be saved. And people scoff at that, and they're like, oh, come on, what does that mean? No. In that day, when he comes back, every single Jew that is there in that day that look upon him are going to be saved. They're going to be converted in their heart. That's an amazing thing. This mass conversion on the day that they see him. We'll be there, right? Because we're coming back with him, right, at the second coming. So we can watch it all happen from right there. Let's bring it back. So we're in chapter 16. We just talked about God changing this dynamic from this near fulfillment of Moab running to this long-term fulfillment in verse 4 of, oh, Moab, you're going to help my outcast dwell with you. And look at verse 5 now. It goes with this in verse 5. And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David. That's in Israel, on the throne of David. Judging and seeking judgment and hastening righteousness. So, verse 4 begins this future fulfillment. Oh, Moab, one day you're going to let my outcast dwell with you. And when you do that, then the King of David, the one that will sit on the throne of David, will come and will be there, and he will execute justice and judgment and bring righteousness. So we jump from this near thing that's happening to Moab to this long-term fulfillment of what's going to happen in verse 4 and verse 5. And now let's read a long section here, starting in verse 6. Verse 6. We've heard of the pride of Moab. We've been talking about that, right? We've heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. Yea, but his lies shall not be so. Therefore shall Moab howl for Moab. Every one shall howl for the foundations of that city. Shall ye mourn? Surely they are stricken. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the heathen have broken down the principal plants thereof. The lords of the heathen, the Assyrian invaders, they have broken down all this plantation. And they are come even unto Jasher. They wandered through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out. They are gone over the sea. Therefore, in verse 9, I will bewail with the wailing of Jasher, the vine of Sibmah. I will water thee with my tears, O Heshbon. Who's talking? It's God. It's God talking to them about their judgment. Do you read the Bible? Do you read the hard things in the Bible with this mind of God saying, and therefore I will smite thee? Ha ha ha. Is that the way you read it? Because that's not there. It's the heart of God to say, I will bewail thee. God, what did we just read from Ezekiel chapter 33? I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked should turn. That's the heart of God, even as we're reading this. God sees the end from the beginning. He knows the nations that are going to come to him. He knows the people that are not. He's simply looking into the future at their choices, knowing they're going to reject him, and he's looking at their judgment, and he's bewailing it. It's not that he's culling down the wrath, so much as he's announcing what they brought on themselves. We struggle so much with the judgment of God, right? We deserve it for what we've done. He just knows that it's going to happen, right? Verse 9, therefore I will bewail with the wailings of Jasher, the vine of Sibmah. I will water thee with my tears, O Heshbon, and in that one in the south. For the shouting for thy summer fruits and for thy harvest is fallen. Verse 10, and gladness is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field, and in the vineyards there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no more wine in their presses. I have made their vintage shouting to cease. So, and in this day, Israel rejected Moab coming to live amongst them as refugees. And notice, in verse 6, their pride mentioned all through verse 6. It's as if God told Israel, they have not repented as a people. Do not accept them in as refugees. In fact, I just want to read real quick from Zephaniah, just a couple of quick verses from Zephaniah chapter 2 about this situation of Moab's pride. It's Zephaniah 2 verse 8, if you want to look at it. But it says, I have heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon also, whereby they have reproached my people, that means Israel, and they have magnified themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be just like Sodom, and the children of Ammon will be just like Gomorrah, even the breeding of Nestles and the salt pits and the perpetual desolations. The residue of my people shall spoil them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. One more verse. This shall they have for their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of the Lord. And so this is it. You think to yourself, well, I'm not harming God's people. I'm just, even today, those that would be indifferent to the slaughter of innocent Israelis that has just happened within the last month, those that would be indifferent to that, say, it's not really any of my business. Pastors all over this country ignoring the subject as if there's some moral equivalency, that they're all equal. Well, they're just in a civil war, No, they're not. They're not. Hamas, in a demonic way, went in and murdered innocent civilians, babies, women, children, and did the worst things to them. And to sit and not call that out as not just barbaric, it's satanic. It's inspired by the devil. To not call that out as being indifferent. In a way, it's being into yourself. That you can't call that out. And we need to. And that's part of Moab's problem here. Verse 12. It shall come to pass when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high places. And again, the high places are their places of worship. when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high places, that he shall come to his sanctuary to pray, but he shall not prevail. And so they come to their temples, to their places to worship false gods. You know the expression, there are no atheists in a foxhole, right? This is the idea. Like, they're getting run out of town by the Assyrians, and what do? They run to their high places. You know, they're looking over, they're praying and they're looking over and they're like, Joe, I've never seen you here in my life. Yes, we need it right now. They're all in the temple. The only problem is they're at the wrong temple. They're at the wrong temple. They're not going to find any help in their false god, Chemosh, at these high places. Verse 13. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord has spoken, saying within 3 years. And so now see, Isaiah is bringing this back to say, he's concluding this chapter 16 about Moab to say, okay, I talked about some recent things. I went really far into the future, but he finishes this section about Moab by saying, okay, but this part, it's going to happen now. So again, verse 14, but now the Lord has spoken, saying within 3 years, as the years of a hireling, and the glory of Moab shall be condemned basically, with all that great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble. And so, within 3 years, and then it says, as the years of a hireling. That just means time's going to fly quick. That's what it means. So this is a very, very specific prophecy that within 3 years of when Isaiah wrote this, the people of Israel that are reading this can trust and count the clock. Okay, God's going to bring judgment on them within 3 years. And of course they did. Under the Assyrian leader Sargon in 722 BC, that's exactly when Assyria went in and destroyed Israel in the north, not Judah, but Israel in the north. Then they finished that year by coming down along the Jordan and they wiped out Moab. And that's exactly what this is talking about. Now, chapter 17, it's just 14 verses. We're going to get through this with our third point about changing of relationships. And so we changed gears in chapter 17. We looked at Moab. Chapter 17 now is going to focus on the burden to the nation of Syria. Remember, not to be confused with Assyria. The Assyrians are the major world ruling power that's headquarters in Nineveh, right? Modern day Kirkuk, Iraq. Syria, that we're going to talk about in chapter 17, is virtually the modern country of Syria, headquarters in what? Damascus. So this is the country we're going to look at here in chapter 17. And I want to present to you that this chapter again talks about relationship building. And it really tells us that relationships will change when we have just a humble acceptance. That will restore a relationship with the one that we really need between us and God. And so this conversation about Syria talks about just humbling ourselves and coming back to God, the one relationship that we need. And so let's look at this to finish this section out. So it's chapter 17, verse 1. That's heavy, man. The burden. Is there any surfer dudes that can read that for me? Okay. It's heavy. The burden. The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. Now look, we've mentioned this from time to time about how many scholars, and I would consider myself not a scholar, but just a commentator, we look at this and we say, this has not happened yet. There's some prophecies that you look at and you say, okay, well, this happened, but it doesn't overrule God from maybe doing it again, right? A near fulfillment, and then maybe God will even do it again. This is one that you look at and you say, this hasn't happened yet. And maybe your translation is even clearer. But verse 1 said, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The language, the indication is, it gets wiped out. Like no one to live there. Wiped out. Now this has happened to major cities all over the world. Cities of antiquity from thousands of years ago, wiped out, never to be lived in again. But it has never happened to Damascus in world history. It's never happened. And so you can look at this and you could say, this has yet to happen. And now certainly Assyria conquered Syria. They did, but they didn't wipe it out. They didn't wipe it out. They only deported a few people. I think it was in just the tens of thousands that they deported, and they took it over to rule in Damascus, in these other cities. So this seems to be yet coming. So as you're watching the spiritual theater, if you're watching geopolitics, and you see, even last night there was further bombing in Syria, right? We have American bases in Syria nobody wants to talk about, okay? There's a lot of bombing that's been happening in Syria. Israel does strikes in there many times over the past month or so. Even yesterday or last night, even America did many strikes in Syria. We've been hitting the Aleppo and the Damascus airports. Israel has been doing that all month. It's very interesting to keep your eyes on Syria and see if something major doesn't happen right there. That maybe that's the catalyst, that launches the involvement of Russia, Turkey, and Iran to finally come in and get involved for the Ezekiel scenario. But we look at this verse and we say, this has not happened yet, that Damascus has been wiped off the map. So it might very well just happen yet. Not that we joy over that, but we look at it and we're like, it hasn't happened yet. So it must have to be happening in the future. So verse 2, the cities of Aroer are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. The fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus. Let me just explain something before I read a large section here. It's talking about the judgment against Syria. But remember, Syria borders Israel in the north, particularly what we call the Golan Heights. Okay? That Golan Heights area over the years is constantly back and forth. Who runs it? Does Israel run it? Does Syria run it? Back and forth. In this day, this was the border between them. And so that's why it mentions Ephraim, which is in Israel. The fortress, in verse 3, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim. That's talking literally about the Golan Heights. That's why everybody wants it. Because it's this high peak that you can look on both sides. Everybody wants that spot. They want that lookout tower. And so here, it's talked about as if Ephraim owns it, but Syria wants it. Very interesting, because it's still that way, even to today. So again, verse 3, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant from Syria. They shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. And in that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. Verse 5, and it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth the corn and reaps the ears with his arm, and it shall be as he that gathereth ears in the valley of Rephaim. In verse 6, yet gleaning grapes shall be left in it. So just a little left. Just after Damascus and these areas of Syria are wiped out, there's not much left, just a little bit. So, it's not describing, a nuclear weapon that makes everything arid and no good, but it's describing a mostly wiped out situation. Again, verse 6, the gleaning grapes shall be left in it as the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the utmost bough, 4 or 5 in the outmost fruitful branches thereof, saith the Lord God of Israel. So this whole Syrian territory and all of this area surrounding Damascus shall be wiped out, but not entirely, is the picture. So there's still a limited fruit production that's happening here. Just interesting, that maybe this will be the staging ground for what happens with Magog, Russia, coming against Israel with the help of Turkey and Persia. And if you've ever wondered how is it that Bible commentators and pastors can stand up here and just tell you that Gog in the scripture, that is Russia? If you've ever wondered that question, how we can directly make that link, come next week as we're going to make that case, and we're going to make the case by using Ethiopia next time we're together. Okay? So you'll get those types of answers given next time. So this is talking about this destruction of Syria and the Golan Heights in northern Israel as the Assyrians come in and invade, but clearly some of this has not yet happened. And then verse 7, and so here's the response to Syria's destruction. It starts in verse 7. At that day shall a man look to his maker. That's exactly what God's been looking for the whole time. Just turn to me. Just ask me for help. Just ask me for wisdom. Just ask me to help you sort this. But at that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. And he shall not look to the altars, to the work of what? His hands. He's not going to do that anymore. Neither shall he respect that which his fingers have done, neither the groves or the images, which are these false gods. But in verse 9, in that day shall his strong cities be as a forsaken bough, and the utmost branches which they left because of the children of Israel, and there shall be desolation. So the response to Syria's destruction is what? They turn to God and Jesus Christ. I hope you see that. If you've never caught that expression in your Old Testament, let me just point that out to you. Verse 7. What? His eyes shall have respect. Let me go back. In that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. That expression, the Holy One of Israel, that is an expression for the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, which of course is the Greek Christ. This is Jesus. They will look to their Maker and to Jesus. I mean, clearly that verse means this is yet coming. Okay? You know, nobody in the Old Testament other than Israel could anticipate the coming of the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel. But he's saying at this time, when the Syrians repent, they will be looking to their Maker. See, they don't know Jehovah God, right? You know your Old Testament, Lord, capital letters, that's Jehovah by name, right? It doesn't say that. That's for Israel, to talk to Jehovah. They know him. But the Syrians, they're going to turn to their Maker and to Jesus in that day. This is coming. This is yet coming in the future. Verse 10. Verse 10, because thou hast forgotten the God of thy salvation. What? What do you mean? You just told the Syrians that they've forgotten the God. What did it say? The God of their salvation? What are you talking about, God? How does the Syrians know you? Because you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and you have not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. Therefore shalt thou plant pleasant plants, and shall set it with strange slips, it says in verse 11, in that day shall you make your plant to grow, and in the morning shalt thou make your seed to flourish. But the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. And so you look at this and you say, well, God's telling Syria that they have forgotten their God. What are you talking about? We so easily forget that God has given revelation of himself to so many of these surrounding nations. Again, did you grow up that way? Did you think that the Old Testament, like God only ever dealt with Israel and like everybody else to be damned? No, it's never been the heart of God. How is it that the Syrians have forsaken the God of their salvation? Does anybody remember? How about just one? We'll give one right now. There was this guy, about 120 years before this. He had leprosy. He didn't know what to do about it. Yeah. And his servant was like, you know, I know a guy. I know a guy in Israel. His name's Elisha. He serves the God of all the universe. And he's done this before. He can heal you. And so Naaman was like, no. Naaman was a powerful general, right? You know those stories. Long story short, Naaman comes. He's skeptical. Bathe in the Jordan. That's dirty water. Why would I do that? And he ends up what? Having faith, trusting in the weird advice, and just did it. That's faith. That's what faith is, because God says do things, and you're like, that's not the way we do it. And God's like, no, really, that's the way we're going to do it. Bathe in the Jordan? That's not right. You know, and he did it. He had faith. He did it. He was saved. He was saved. Naaman was saved, and he was a powerful man. He went back. There's more to the story. We won't get into it. Gehazi, best part of that story is Gehazi. There's your homework. Go read about Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. I'll leave that alone because we're really late. Naaman got saved. Naaman goes back. People in Syria get saved. It spreads. The Ethiopian eunuch, Philip preaches to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. He gets saved. And he goes back to what? A powerful people in the palace with the Princess Candace, right? Naaman, the general, goes back. These are the generals serving with the king of Syria. They have influence. People get saved. The nation got the knowledge of the Lord. Please make sure you understand that. God's not blanketly judging people that had no knowledge. These are people that knew Him, that had years, decades to experience Him. And their sin listed here is what? They have forgotten the Lord. That sin is still called out by God all the time, including Revelation chapter 2, to the church in Ephesus. Only 40 to 50 years after they were given the gospel, by the year 80 or 90 AD, God is already having to chastise the church in Ephesus by saying what? You have left your first love. And that's the challenge. Don't lose what we have, church. You have the greatest thing you could have, the love of God. Don't forsake that. Don't misuse that. Don't ever trifle it. That's awesome. Satan doesn't need to make us evil. He just needs to make us forget how good God is. Right? Verse 12 to 14. Verse 12, woe to the multitude of many people which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far away, and shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. And behold, at eveningtide, trouble. And before the morning, he is not, or he's been taken away. This is the portion of them that spoil us, and this is the lot of them that rob us. So, not the warning. It's warning the nations, that would come against Israel or that would come against Syria, and it's saying you'll get yours too. So all of these nations that would look at the downfall of Israel, of Syria, and it would say, oh, you'll get what's coming to you also. All those that mete out injustice at all levels will have their day of judgment. That thought ends up penetrating through many of these chapters to remind them, don't gloat because somebody else is getting justice. Don't gloat. Somebody goes to jail for something. We don't gloat. We're not excited for that. It might be justice, and you might have a sense of satisfaction, but you're not rejoicing. And so the warning there at the end from God is to say, don't rejoice because somebody else has their downfall. That's not the way we look at that. So these are burdens or heavy messages, and they're not just because it's not just a burden because they'll bring heartache to the nations. But these are written as burdens because they bring a heartache to God. God looks at somebody going through a trouble or somebody getting judged. Have you been a parent yet and had to judge your kid? If you're a good parent, you don't I'm so glad I got to spank them today. It doesn't work that way, in case you're wondering. That's not the way a parent feels, okay? Nobody ever feels that way. And that's God's heart too. It breaks the heart of God. But what did he say in chapter 15? In chapter 15, verse 6, my heart shall cry. That's the way he feels about having to judge. So, be careful as we look at the relationships in these chapters. Just remember some of those relational lessons that we learned. Watch out for being self-focused. Make sure that doesn't creep in and ruin relationships. What does it take for you to ruin a relationship with somebody you're close to? Just do nothing. Just do nothing. Independence might seem fine, but it doesn't build a relationship. It actually tears it down. So we have to be intentional. We have to be intentional about our relationships. Number 2, we can restore earthly relationships by seeking comfort, by seeking aid and mutual help. What about just reaching out to somebody and just saying, hey, listen, I know I haven't been very available to you, but I just wanted to know if you ever need anything, text me. Maybe just that is what you need to do next. Just call them and say, hey, I'm available. I'm available. Let me know what you need. There's always some way to show that you're available. I think that's the point. Just make yourself available. And then third and finally, we can restore even our heavenly relationships, just like Syria found. And what did it take for Syria in chapter 17 to restore their relationship with their Maker and with the Holy One of Israel? Just humbly admit it. Just humbly admit that you need him. There is hell to pay for our evil deeds. But thankfully for us that have come to the cross, we have had that paid for at the cross. And we're grateful for that. So the title of the message, was because Jesus himself cries out because of broken relationship. God himself cries out because of broken relationship. So we don't want that to be his experience with us in our earthly relationships. We want to be a people that restores, that mends, that reaches out, that helps bring them back. So let's be that people, right?